Hi, hello. Welcome to the second in our three-part series, Reproductive Justice, Jewish Ethics, and Family Planning, Post-Roe Realities, offered by a Dutch Lum Reconstructionist congregation, with gratitude to our co-sponsors, the Center for Jewish Ethics at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and the National Council of Jewish Women. I'm Minna Sherlander Morse, and I was honored to be invited by a Dutch Lum's Jewish Studies Committee co-chairs, one of whom, Deborah Trope, is here, to coordinate a series that would provide an opportunity for participants to learn about one, an array of consequences and potential consequences of the Dobbs decision, two, how these myriad issues might be approached via Jewish ethics, and three, what folks need to know to take Jewishly and ethically grounded, fact-based stands on any number of current and potential policy issues. So the result is a series on how the overturn of Roe v. Wade impacts not only access to basic reproductive health and the choice to not grow a family at a particular time, but also complexifies the realities and ethics of various means of growing our families. And tonight we're moving on to the growing our families part. Each week we have wonderful experts joining us, and this week is no different. I think spotlighted here are our two speakers, Milan Pham and Kenter Sarah Meyerson. As I mentioned in an email to registrants as of last night, Rabbi Lila Kajetan, who was to be with us, faced an unexpected and unavoidable conflict. But one, she'd love to come back another time in a format like this with Milan, with Sarah, with anyone on a topic like this or otherwise. And two, our co-sponsors at NCJW helped connect us with Kenter Sarah, a wonderful new addition to the lineup. But before I fully introduce tonight's speakers, a few housekeeping items. Same as last week. We're asking that everyone stay on mute, and Carol Stern, our wonderful tech volunteer, should have that covered. We're a large group and we want to be mindful of everyone's time, and with time at the end, we can sort of open up the floor. We will be at the very end. We will be welcoming questions and seeking answers at intervals throughout and at the end of the panel discussion. So please, we invite you to drop questions in the chat. You can send them to either Carol or myself. The speakers will not be looking at questions. We'll be funneling them to them. And there's a piece where I'm going to be helping present something with Sarah. And during that time, please deliver any relevant questions to Carol. So we'll track questions and share them aloud with their speakers at the appropriate junctures. And I sent out a handout last night to registrants for today's session to that point. Recommended resources, not required, but we're dropping the link in the chat for anyone who may not have received it. And now I'm incredibly pleased to welcome our speakers in alphabetical order and order of appearance, Kenter Sarah Meyerson and Milan Pham. Briefly, Kenter Sarah Meyerson is an advisory board member of Rabbis for Repro with National Council of Jewish Women. In addition to teaching about Jewish halakhic and ethical perspectives on reproduction, she also speaks from her own experience as a Jewish person who has struggled with infertility, pregnancy loss, abortion, and assisted reproductive technologies. She serves as cantor at the Kane Street Synagogue in Brooklyn, New York, and warns us that there may be sirens in the background intermittently because she's in Brooklyn. And the rest of us have dogs, and there may be dogs barking intermittently, but we'll get through it. Milan Pham is a founding partner of Nicholson Pham, a boutique law firm located in Durham, North Carolina, centered on emerging issues of family formation and dissolution, including surrogacy, assisted reproductive technology, and adoption. She is an ART fellow with the American Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproduction Attorneys. Milan is also a member of the National Family Law Advisory Council of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and serves on the boards of the Pauli Murray Center for History and Social Justice, Equality North Carolina, and Carolina Jews for Justice, among other positions. And she also serves on the Modern Family Committee and the Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Committee of the North Carolina Bar Association. Tonight, we're going to talk about assisted reproductive technologies, which so many people facing physical or social infertility turn to in hopes of building their families. Anecdotally, Jews more likely to put off pregnancy until later in life, statistically more affluent, may indeed turn to ART in numbers disproportionate to their percentage of the population. Likewise, of people seeking to get pregnant, LGBTQ plus prospective parents who often rely on egg or sperm donors and often surrogates also are likely disproportionately represented seeking ART interventions. We're going to start by hearing from Kendra Meyerson, who has said I can call her Sarah, as has Milan, told me I can call her Milan. So Sarah will be talking about her own journey with ART. Then she and I will tag team on a slide presentation about Jewish takes via halakha and Jewish ethics on the complexity of ART, even before throwing in the fear of restriction that comes with Dobbs v. Jackson decision. Then Milan will talk with us about the impact on LGBTQ plus prospective parents and LGBTQ plus families in general in the wake of that decision. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. You've been through a complicated reproductive journey. How have your own experiences informed your advocacy for reproductive rights?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to join this group. I should say that while I do serve Kane Street Synagogue, any opinions that I'm expressing here are my own and not necessarily representative of the community that I serve. Something was drawing me to abortion rights advocacy before I ever got pregnant. And part of that is some of the stories from my own family. So I was already lobbying on behalf of Planned Parenthood, especially with other clergy people for reproductive rights. But it became much more real when I had my first ectopic pregnancy back in 2018. For those that might not have heard of an ectopic pregnancy, it's when the pregnancy implants somewhere not in the uterus. And while some politicians would have you believe that you can just let it go and it will just sort of heal itself magically, that's not a reliable option. I can tell you, as someone who has experienced now 2 of them, they are medical emergencies, and it is life-threatening that the treatment of these pregnancies can be interfered with by politicians rather than a medical care team. So for me, I had an ectopic pregnancy. The first one couldn't be managed medically, so I had to have a surgical abortion that took part of 1 tube. And I was really confused because, you know, like, is a medical injection an abortion? Obviously it is. We didn't talk about it that way. And I had this moment of like, oh, did I just have an abortion? Should I have talked to someone about this? Do I need counseling? What's the halakha on that as a Jewishly observant person? It was very confusing for me, but I didn't doubt that I'd made the right decision. And then later, when that didn't work and I had the surgery, I thought, oh, well, does that count as an abortion if it didn't work? Have I now had 2 abortions, 1 medical, 1 surgical for 1 pregnancy? Just, you know, in the mind, that was a very confusing time for me of like how to process what I was doing health-wise. I had, after that, a uterine pregnancy that miscarried when the heart stopped beating, and exercised my rights as a New Yorker to terminate that with a DNC rather than waiting in terminal weeks for the pregnancy to miscarry by itself. Everyone should have that option. No one should be forced to wait for a non-viable, non-living pregnancy to miscarry naturally, unless that's something that the patient wants to do as a grieving process. It was a big relief to be able to just go into a hospital, have that taken care of professionally, and to be able to move on with my grieving process. Then I had an ectopic pregnancy in the other tube that was managed medically, but it turned out that the tubes were no good, so turned to IVF next. No one just lightly decides to do IVF. People that are coming to IVF are, as we heard, making these decisions because we've tried everything else, or because we don't have any of the right anatomy for that to happen. I don't have to explain that obviously queer couples of all types might need to use IVF, but also plenty of couples that might look like cis-het pairs might be missing tubes, or might have low sperm motility, or might have other reasons. So anyway, in our case, IVF was the only thing left. We did an egg retrieval and got an embryo out of that, made it to transfer. That didn't implant, so that was sort of a 4th pregnancy loss if you count that way. And since then, I've been doing various tests to discover other medical issues that I need to resolve before I can go through all this again. And as you said, Jewish people are often more affluent than the average. And I spent, I think, 40% of my gross compensation last year on fertility. That is more than I spent on rent and utilities. I have waited over a year to do IVF again, partly because I couldn't afford to do that. IVF is a crazy thing where your insurance doesn't have to cover it. They might cover for some people, if you're really lucky, you might have an insurance. In New York, insurers don't have to offer IVF coverage for private individuals. I have excellent insurance otherwise, but it doesn't cover any of this sort of stuff. So it's a real ethical question of, do you really want to put more money into trying to conceive a child? It's a financial consideration that most people are not able to choose. And it's a dangerous thing to get yourself into. I've had complications from every one of the procedures that I've had that have sent me back months. So I don't recommend it lightly, but it is something that we're grappling with tonight from an ethical perspective, from a Jewish perspective, religiously, halachically, and obviously socially, as we'll get to much more as the night goes on. I think you're muted, Minna.
Yet again. Thank you, Sarah. And Sarah and I are about to present together a slideshow that is gonna, let me share my screen, which, as Jamil said last week, is so hard to do in front of people. I loved that. Share screen. Okay, great. And then I'm going to shrink dink all of us so I can see. Okay. Sorry. So we're going to try to tackle the nuts and bolts of assisted reproductive technologies for you, to make it a little easier to understand the pieces. It's so much. I went through fertility treatments and a lot has changed, even since I did it 20 years ago. And talk about where there are traditional halakhic or Jewish legal sticking points or considerations in the process, and where there are broader ethical and Jewish ethical considerations in IVF, and how the looming threat of fetal personhood law confounds and complicates everything further. So I'm going to do the first part, sort of some round foundational stuff, and then I'm going to pass it on to Sarah to sort of unpack in detail the halakhic concerns and the technology, and where ethical issues specifically kind of come into play. Generally, I'm putting here the sort of basic components of ART, most of which we will address, going from the very simplest to more complicated, and then at the bottom, so complicated that it's above my pay grade and I'm not going to bother addressing it. I don't know if people know about this stuff, but the earliest and most essential form of ART is artificial insemination, or IUI, intrauterine insemination, where it's simply where semen is inserted into a woman's uterus, and hopefully conception will happen. It helps with some instances of either physical or social fertility. So with a woman without a partner, or a woman with a partner who doesn't have semen, and truthfully, I'm forgetting what the physical, you can choose what semen goes, etc. the big innovation that opens up so many other doors for other innovations was in vitro fertilization, which back when I was young was called test tube babies. We don't do that anymore, but it is the opportunity to take an egg and sperm and combine them outside of a body, and that opens doors to other technologies. So where IUI, you can use donor sperm only with in vitro fertilization, can someone without viable eggs or any eggs get donor eggs? And each of these pieces, as Sarah will later explain, are complicated ethically. It also opens the door for surrogacy, where an embryo created outside of the womb can be implanted into the womb of someone who may carry for intended parents who don't have a womb or don't have a womb capable of carrying a fetus to full term. And it opens the door to screening which embryos might be the best embryo or embryos to implant. And that is endlessly complicated and beneficial and ethically complicated. So we're going to sort of skip ahead and talk a little bit about this idea of personhood, which we talked a little bit about last week. And for some reason, there we go. So we talked a bit about when a human in human development is one considered to have equal rights to any other living person. And in Jewish tradition, we were clear last week that that is at birth. So I've sort of got many junctures in the development of a embryoblastid fetus, et cetera, that someone might consider that life begins, or someone might consider that that life deserves the same rights as a living person walking around. Again, Jewish tradition has that at birth. Roe v. Wade had that not at viability, but not to be conferred before viability outside the womb. There are many states with heartbeat laws that when there's an electrical impulse and with the rhythm of a heartbeat, I don't know about the technology, but I'm led to understand that's not exactly the same as a heartbeat. And maybe there's someone who can speak to that more specifically. But the 6 week is in quotes here because it's not 6 weeks of gestation, but 6 weeks since the last menstrual period. So that could be as short as 2 weeks of gestation. And this next one, gastrulation, is a term I just learned today, but I think it's worth knowing about. So gastrulation, which happens at about 2 weeks, is when the cells sort of get directed to specific functions. They're like post-stem cell possibility, right? They are gastric cells or kidney cells or brain cells or skin cells. And it is at that point that the organism cannot split into twins or triplets. And so maybe at that point, someone might say that that unique life starts, not necessarily a life that has personhood conferred upon it, or legal rights conferred upon it. At implantation, many bioethicists do not think that life, any form of life, necessarily begins before implantation. And if you do believe that, and most of the power from the religious right pushing all of this do believe that it starts at conception. But if you think it starts at conception and not an implantation, then there are certain birth control methods. This is not an IVF issue, but it's worth noting that certain methods of contraception are suddenly, outlawable, like an IUD, which can not only prevent through hormones conception, but it can disrupt implantation. So that's just sort of where the threat is this idea that, and specifically for IVF, going back to the idea that life begins at conception, and thus legal personhood and legal rights should be conferred, as early as whenever conception is happening, which is really hard to track. So I want to go through some just core Jewish ethical concerns regarding that are relevant here. And I think relevant for all sorts of ways of growing families. And the first is that it is a Jewish belief that building families is a good thing. It's a good thing. So there is a lot of we have a very pronatalist tradition and culture, and that only is a little tricky and sometimes goes overboard. So it goes a little overboard sometimes when childless people feel marginalized for not having families, when there's a inverse relationship between a woman's education and her fertility and childbearing or child rearing, when there are impacts on her career disproportionate to men in parenting. We saw a lot of that during COVID, actually, and over, concerns about overpopulation and stressing the earth. There's also, the argument where we as Jews are such a small percentage of the population, and we have work to do to rebuild, and that's all of it's in there. It's all in the mix. Another here is just the general reverence for all life and potential life. So Judaism does not think that early stages of development in the womb are not worthy of care or concern, obviously, but it is that is not considered a person until birth. So that there's an increasing status or reverence, and I think Mira Wasserman went over this last week. There's an increasing status and reverence for the development, but through pregnancy until the baby comes out of the womb and is considered equal amongst us. So then some other general ethical principles to keep in mind in building family and in approaching IVF. One is consideration and clarity around the needs, the desires, and the relationships of all the adults and some children directly and indirectly involved. So that's the intended parents, one and all. That is the donors, that is the surrogate, that is everybody involved, that is for children, the siblings, both of, they call donor siblings dibblings. Some people like that, some people don't, but it's cute. There's lots of ways, and Sarah may go more into that. And those indirectly relatives, like how are the people in more distant layers of family feeling about the situation? They're not necessarily the most important things to value, but it's all in the mix. Consideration of best interests of the child, which is a sort of vague notion, and depends on various understandings of what children fundamentally need to thrive. And one of these I'm going to throw in is an increasing understanding of the need for donor-conceived kids, children of surrogacy, adoptees, et cetera, to know more, have expressed need to know more about their genetic identity and sort of who they are, where they come from. So that's a best interest in the child that is not necessarily often historically been considered. Is there risk, harm, or exploitation caused to anyone in a technique or path to parenthood? In conservative halakha, I don't know Orthodox as well, and I studied it at JTS briefly. So I know the conservative halakha a little more. Concerns about the impact on an egg donor, the physical impact on an egg donor. Concerns about which Sarah will go into more, questions of exploitation or risks to a surrogate, et cetera. And lastly, is access to parent equitable via the reproductive justice lens that we talked about last week. So the cost of these technologies is enormous. And that's mentioned in conservative halakha, I will say, as sort of who is the privileged to parent. And diversity of donors, the racial makeup of the sperm donor banks in America is pretty homogenous, not entirely, but pretty. And also, is the access to parenthood available to LGBTQ parents, which Milan will talk more about. I'm going to pass it on to Sarah to talk about halakha, but first I want to just remind folks of like how Jews broadly view halakha differently. Just repeating Mira Wasserman's slide from last week. For some Jews, halakha is the source of thinking about what's good and just. And some Jews see the legal rulings as unnecessary but insufficient for deciding ethical questions. It's a floor, like you have to follow this, but you can think more. And which brings us to number 3. Some Jews respect halakha whether they're following it or not, but subject it to specific ethical critique. And I just want to bring your attention in the handout. You don't have to look at it now, but there's an article by Lila Kedjeden and a co-author she's an open Orthodox, she's a modern Orthodox rabbi, and one of the first women to be conferred the title of rabbi through her yeshiva. It talks about how to look at the permissibility of IVF through a less gendered lens. Like it's not just that it helps us meet the man's requirement in halakha to be fruitful and multiply, but there are values that aren't that tied to just the male experience. And then lastly, some Jews, including Reconstructionists, give halakha or Jewish legal tradition a vote, but not a veto in their living of Jewish values and in their ethical decision making. Regardless of how much we know, we are, by having Jewish values transmitted to us, we are giving some degree of vote, but not veto to halakha. So Sarah, I'm going to pass it on to you. And tell me when to switch slides. I'm going to start with this one.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm aware that I am speaking to a community that might not be guided primarily by halakha. And so what I would say is if you are really curious about the variety of halakhic opinions that are out there, I will put in the chat some links to websites where you can look at these more in detail, because as we said, there are a lot of people who are Jewish who really care about halakha, who really need assistive reproductive technologies to build their families, whether that's for a first child or for something called secondary infertility, which is when you might have had a successful pregnancy, but you're struggling to have subsequent pregnancies for whatever reason. We'll get to this later on, but I'll just put a little note here to say that we have a lot of inbreeding, especially in traditional Ashkenazi communities. And so there are a lot of genetic diseases. And if you and your partner both have the same genetic carrier status and want to conceive, you might find yourself doing IVF as a way of genetic selection around those kinds of potential diseases. So I'm going to put these 2 links if you're interested in looking in depth at various halachic opinions on each of these issues, and then I'll go sort of more broadly through each of the items on this slide. Okay, so Pur'u Uravu, one of our first mitzvot, if you look back at the creation stories in Genesis and Bereshit, is God encourages us to be fruitful and to multiply. Rabbinic thought recognized that traditionally the people that were carrying pregnancies and giving birth were in great danger. That is true even today in the US. We have terrible mortality rates for pregnant people, but it was particularly so in the time that our rabbinic law codes were being established. And so they limited this pur'uravu, this obligation to be fruitful and multiply, as Minna was saying, to men, because it was thought, well, there's not so much danger in obligating men, or at least people with sperm, with semen, to be fruitful and multiply, whereas there was a significant danger component to people who would be carrying and delivering pregnancies. So it's not traditionally understood to be an obligation of women, shall we say. That said, as you can imagine, women in all sorts of communities face enormous pressure from society, from their families, and from themselves to be fruitful and multiply. So that is a complicated ethical and halachic minefield of, no one is obligated to do IVF if you can't keep a pregnancy. But I think we're also seeing a lot more sensitivity today in terms of like assisting couples who might want to be fruitful and multiply, and what can that mean socially, institutionally. Okay, hashchatat zera. Is there wasted, spilled, or slaughtered seed? Okay, so we're talking about sperm, about semen here. The general consensus is that if there's a need for a person who can produce sperm or semen to ejaculate outside of traditionally understood intercourse, that is not a problem halachically. However, I can tell you that every time you do a fertility workup, they are going to need to test the sperm producing partners. So there is a lot of wasted seed for testing purposes, whether that's donor sperm or husband sperm, whether it's a Jewish person or a non-Jewish person. There is going to be a lot of that happening, and it is a complicated thing. To what extent is that okay? Are there parameters? In a traditional context, is the marital bond violated? Okay, so here we're talking about theoretically, if there's a couple that is a man and a woman, and you're needing to bring in something from another person, whether it's a donor egg, surrogacy, donor sperm, are we violating a marital bond? I would also say there are some considerations here for people who follow traditional halakha. Some women might be uncomfortable being touched by a male nurse or a male doctor, might feel uncomfortable being alone in a woman with a male nurse or a male doctor. And the onus is obviously going to be on the woman patient to speak up those halachic concerns. It means that instead of just having a medical discussion with your care team, you're also having a religious discussion about the unconventional things that your religion expects of you, whether it's yichud or shornagia of not being alone in a room with a person of a different gender, or not having physical contact with a person of a different gender. While I'm on that, someone who's living a traditionally observant life and going through IVF is going to have everything turned upside down, because at some point you're going to need to come in with very little notice to a doctor appointment on a Saturday morning, and you're going to have to figure out a way of staying in walking distance of your doctor's office and signing forms in advance. There are all sorts of halachic and ethical considerations to be made in a Jewish context as soon as you get involved in assisted reproductive technologies. Okay, who is the father? That comes in terms of, obviously, is it the person who's producing the sperm or the semen? What about if you have two fathers who are using a surrogate? Maybe you're combining semen in that case. Who is considered the father? Are there two fathers? If one of them is a Cohen or a Levi, which one passes that down? If you have two women who are building their family and using donor sperm, can one of those women pass on Cohen or Levi status? Can one of those women pass on Judaism? Does it have to be the pregnancy carrying woman? If one woman is carrying the pregnancy and the other is donating the embryo, which one counts as the mother? Can they both be the mother for Jewish status, for Cohen Levi status? These are all real questions, and I can tell you, in my capacity as a clergy person, I go through these questions with families, and I am lucky that I am part of a movement that recognizes that these are real situations and gives some power to people to make those decisions for themselves. But I think increasing numbers of communities are going to have to figure out ways of doing this with sensitivity and acknowledgement of the real situation on the ground, with increasingly complicated ways of building families in communities that are Jewish. Okay, is the child Jewish? I just mentioned some of the concerns there with who is giving what. Okay, next slide, shall we? And again, put questions in the chat because I'm rushing through these and using a lot of terms, some of them Hebrew, some of them medical. Okay, simple introduction to IVF. You start with the person that's going to have their eggs extracted, whether this is someone who is doing donor embryos or whether this is the woman in the I'll use myself as an example because we had a relatively simple sex. So I was the person that was going to be stimming, as we call it. You, first of all, you have all of these fertility workup appointments where you're turning your life upside down to go in for all of these appointments, and everything is tied to your menstrual cycle. So you just have to hope you have a flexible calendar and can take off to do all these tests and things. But then stimming is when you are injecting yourself with thousands of dollars of medication to first encourage the growth of as many follicles as possible so you can retrieve as many eggs as possible, and on a very timed production line, because the thing with ovulation is you have all these little follicles and then one particularly strong egg is favored and then it's ovulated out in seconds. So your medical team has to catch you at just the right moment and stimulate ovulation so that they can pull as many eggs as possible. Some people manage to get 20, 30 eggs, but that's not a guarantee of anything because they die off at each of the stages that we're going to go through here. Some people only get one egg, even with all of that stimulating. Egg extraction. This can be something that is done with no anesthesia. It could be something that's done under general anesthesia. It depends on what complicating medical factors you have. The ideal is that you have your sperm donor producing sperm at the same time as you have your eggs being extracted, so they can be combined freshly. Minna was alluding to this earlier. It's either done with just all the semen injected into all the eggs and you hope for the best, or in some cases, particularly if you have low sperm motility or other complicating factors, you might do something called ICSI, which is when you inject individual sperm into individual eggs in the hope that you're getting the best of each. In some cases, that might not be possible. Maybe someone has had a cancer diagnosis and they have frozen their eggs or their sperm, and now it is time to defrost them and combine them, so they might not be fresh for whatever reason. You hope that the two are going to combine and they're going to fertilize, and then they're going to make it to blastocyst, and they're going to have a normal number of chromosomes. But as I said, at this point, at every stage you have drop-off. So you might get 30 eggs, maybe 24 of them are mature, maybe 18 of them fertilize, and maybe 12 of those make it to blastocyst, and maybe 8 of those are chromosomally normal, and some of them are mosaic, or some of them are abnormal, or you decide not to test them and just hope for the best. But at every stage of this, you're losing. So that's why, again, the stimulating that happens in the beginning. Then you've done your making your embryo. Some people do a fresh transfer, which is when you, on your next menstrual cycle, start taking more medications. This time you're doing intramuscular injections instead of in your skin layer injections. Then you transfer the embryo. I wish we could do implantation of embryos. We unfortunately cannot implant. Okay, we cannot implant embryos. We just transfer them. We put them in there and we hope that they implant. Okay, so you can, if you're not using all the embryos you have in the moment, you're going to freeze some of them. And this, of course, as you can see at the last point, gets to what do you do with those extra embryos? Which in states that have these personhood laws that go back to conception, you can't destroy them, even though Judaism says you can destroy them. This is a big issue because it's expensive to store embryos, and If you have abnormal embryos that your doctor will not let you transfer, but the state will not let you destroy them, then you're the one that's picking up the bill to store those indefinitely until you can figure out moving them to a state where you can destroy them or something else, or transferring them and risking a horrible pregnancy. Anyway, okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, involvement of other parties. I touched on this already in several places. Donor sperm. In terms of ethics, the ideal has been to use a non-Jewish donor because the theory was the intermarriage rate was so low that you'd have a lower risk of the kid marrying a sibling if you use donor sperm. Now that intermarriage rates are, last I checked, around 68% for Jewish people, and even higher if you exclude the ultra-Orthodox community, that no longer holds. So in some cases, it's preferred to use Jewish donor sperm, as long as you know who the donor is so you can track. This is also good because, as Minna was saying, an increasing number of children want to know their full ethnic and biologic spectra of parenthood. Egg donation. Again, what you're looking for scientifically to have the best chance of it implanting is someone, with a similar profile, but it's very hard to get an egg donor. Oh, sorry. You might ask your sibling to be an egg donor, for example. That could be complicated ethically, as you can imagine. Maybe siblings have disagreements and then retract who owns the egg. Surrogacy. Okay, so traditionally we're talking about finding, well, a gestational carrier is when your embryo is carried by someone else. You could also have surrogacy where someone else's embryo is being carried by them, or where someone who has already become pregnant through some other form but isn't able to or doesn't desire to keep the baby might be giving it up sort of for adoption. That could be considered a surrogacy pregnancy. I'm sort of running through these out of order here. Issues. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. This kind of thing is very expensive. It can be exploitative because the people who might be willing to do this kind of thing for money, there's often would someone be willing to put themselves through this kind of a dangerous thing if they weren't desperate for money? And there is a certain feeling, at least that I have, of like perpetuating the existing structures we have, where some people, I don't know if I'm being very clear here, but you get what I mean. Motherhood status management, etc. Okay, embryo donation. I think we spoke about that already. I know people who have been on lists for embryo donation for months. And I hate to say it, but it does seem to have a racial component, in that we said that there is more availability of certain types of sperm donors and certain types of egg donors than others. And parent or would-be parents who have preferences, you can go with what you want and then wait months and months and months. You can be open to anything and still wait months and months and months because of institutional racism that might be directed towards you. But I'm trying to focus on ethics that stick with halakha, so I'm going to move on. Issues. Cost. Yes, cost is ridiculous. There are a few companies that offer IVF coverage to their employees, but not many. The risk or harm to the people that are going through it. It's dangerous. You can hurt yourself badly at every stage. None of us are trained. Well, I would say very few people are trained nurses. And then all of a sudden you're supposed to know how to inject yourself with medication and you're going through all these procedures. And any pregnancy, even a healthy, naturally conceived pregnancy, is hugely dangerous to the person that's carrying the pregnancy. let alone when you add all of these other procedures. Anonymity, child's identity. I think we touched on that already. Next slide. All right. Yes, I mentioned this earlier. We have all sorts of different genetic screenings we can do. So this can be good. We can now find out if embryos have the normal number of chromosomes, if they are, what quality. The doctors will give them grades so that you can decide like, oh, I think I'll transfer my second quality grade embryo first because we want to see if there are any problems with transfer, and I want to wait with my best quality embryo until after we figure that issue out. I mentioned also it can be possible to screen for specific genetic mutations that would be useful if, say, both parents or multiple parents of whatever constellation of parents you have are carriers for Tay-Sachs, or one of the many diseases that are more common amongst Jewish people. However, we get into ethical concerns here with designer babies, among other things. Not only that, but you can choose to find out the sex chromosomes. You can't find out the gender of your child, I remind you, but you can find out what chromosomes they have. Are people going to choose boys over girls? Who knows? Are we going to get to a point where you can choose other physical attributes or other kinds of genetic selections? I imagine we will, especially since, let's be real, the people who can afford to do IVF are the people who might be trying to select for the, you know, the tallest, the smartest, the whatever advantages in life anyway. Who knows? Okay. And again, here we get to, I mentioned this earlier, but what happens when you find that you have an embryo that is likely to turn into a child who has Tay-Sachs or some other debilitating child disease that is likely to cause early death? What do you do with that embryo? Because you could probably transfer it, it might implant, you might have a pregnancy, you might have a child who might die in their toddler years. Should couples be forced to try that? Should couples be allowed to destroy those embryos? These are things that, unfortunately, states are getting involved in, where I think the really more sensitive thing to do would be to leave it up to parents and their medical team, because if the government isn't going to support you through every stage of the process, they shouldn't be able to require you to go through it, is my personal opinion. And no one should have to pay for the funeral of an embryo, especially if your religion doesn't require something like a funeral or burial. Okay, do we have one more screen? Are we done? It's one more screen, I think.
I think that's the last.
Oh, that's the last one. Somehow I remembered them in a different order. No, this is good. Okay.
Okay. I've got,
yeah, that's number 10.
So one, Ralph Nitkin, who seems is our token male this evening. I don't know who else is out there. Actually, there might have been more men joining us, who knows a lot about this stuff. Pointed out that the multiple embryo.
Oh yeah.
And how how ethically challenging that has been over time. And I think many fertility clinics and
yeah.
Actually, Milan might be able to speak to this later. Just like bringing the number down.
So it used to be that doctors would transfer 2-3 embryos, whatever, in the hope that one would stick. And sometimes you had situations where, say, they all stuck and you suddenly had triplet pregnancy and one of them had to be terminated to allow for the safe development of the others. And that is an increasingly complicated landscape, ethically as well as legally. I would say that is decreasing now. There are an increasing number of fertility clinics that are so confident in their transfer rates that they are discouraging patients from transferring 2 or 3. The cases where you still see that happening is for patients who don't want to test their embryos. They want to just transfer what they have, especially if they're a little bit older and they have some embryos and they just want to give it a go and see what happens. But you can end up with twins or triplets, and of course that increases pregnancy complications, as well as the likelihood of any of them surviving to term.
And lastly, and I'm just
Yeah.
gonna, I read something today that relates to something else that Ralph put up there, which was that so many embryos don't make it. And that I was reading somebody the other day who said that if we take personhood at conception seriously, that the number of deaths in pregnancy would make pregnancy a public health crisis.
Yeah.
So it's just an interesting twist on that. But with that, I want to turn to Milan to talk about, thank you, Sarah, to talk about the impact of all of this on LGBTQ families and the impact more generally on Dobbs v. Jackson and in other ways. Milan.
Yeah. Good evening, folks. I'm glad to be here. In my practice, I concentrate largely on LGBT families. It didn't start out that way. Just ended up being that there was such a need in the community, and the community is always looking for representation from one of its own. So it's been important to the community that I understand what it means to have a family that is marginally protected in so many ways. And Dobbs versus Jackson was really concerning for the LGBT community, I think primarily because of, its potential impact on Obergefell. I mean, that was sort of the initial concern, is that, if Dobbs could be reversed and precedent could be ignored, that would kind of flow into Obergefell, which stems directly from the thinking related to privacy that was established in Roe versus Wade. That, of course, is not the only issue that the LGBT community is concerned about. Marriage is sort of, in some ways, the last of our concerns. Cases stemming from Roe include cases that are about the right to contraception, the right to sexual freedom, the right to bodily autonomy, the right to parent exclusively your children. All of these constitutional liberties were built case by case from Roe. And so what happens when Dobbs reverses Roe is that all of the thinking that undergirds all of those cases, becomes a potential for challenge. For the LGBT community, the issue of marriage is a little more stable at this point because the Respect for Marriage Act has been passed. And what the Respect for Marriage Act says is that where a marriage is granted, if it is legally granted in the state, then every other state is required to give it full faith and credit. What the Respect for Marriage Act doesn't do is it does not require a state to grant marriage. And so the possibility of the reversal of Obergefell continues to be really present for our community. And what we're seeing, quite frankly, is that people who are opposed to marriage equality and LGBT rights and general assemblies across the country are really chipping away at LGBT rights in the same way that abortion rights have been chipped away over the years since Roe, leading up to Dobbs ultimately. And simultaneously with the chipping away, they're also, at the federal court level, they're also simultaneously introducing a tsunami of anti-LGBT legislation all across the country. In North Carolina, we were expecting 2 bills, which we thought we would have under control, neither of which would pass the House. And ultimately, if they did pass, they would be, subject to a veto by the governor. And instead of having 2 bills, we got 8. We got a Democrat that defected to the Republicans, and now they have a veto-proof majority. And they have passed all kinds of problematic bills already. Trans youth sports ban, in addition to a drag ban that is widely expected to pass probably by the end of this week. And the problem with a lot of these bills is they don't just outlaw events. They're drafted in such a way that they outlaw people. And so from our perspective, this is all part and parcel of the political landscape that we've landed in because of Dobbs. Dobbs was just the beginning. And now we're seeing all of these other issues cascading and compounding the lives of people who have been marginally protected historically, and some more marginally protected than others. If you have intersecting and overlapping marginalized identities, then things get worse rapidly. And so, I guess there's the immediate concern of Dobbs, which is, we're looking at 13 states that have enacted bans on in-state abortion care. We're looking at more states that are trying to do that. There are some states that are enacting shield laws to protect abortion rights, and also, enacting constitutional amendments that are going to make it possible for abortion to continue to be legal, no matter what happens in the courts necessarily. But there are just a handful of states. And so what we're looking at across the country is this picture of places that are sanctuary for marginally protected people, women, people of color, LGBT folks, and the more you fall into multiple marginally protected categories, the more important it will be for you to be near one of those sanctuary types of states. There are a lot of restrictions related to abortion care that are happening post-Dobbs as well, and they're getting really creative. The anti-choice folks are really creative in the ways that they're looking to restrict our access to medically necessary care. They're doing things like attaching incentives to tax codes, creating tax-exempt entities inside of legislation to receive preferred donations, right? In state tax law. They're also using religious freedom to allow medical providers to deny medically appropriate care just based on a sincerely held religious belief. It's one of the laws that we're looking at now in North Carolina, that medical providers would be allowed to deny care to LGBT folks because they have a sincerely held religious belief. And it could be any kind of life-saving care. It doesn't have to be care around gender-specific, for instance, trans healthcare. It doesn't have to be that. It could be any kind of care. Could be care for, a heart attack, could be care for cancer, could be anything. And if they had a sincerely held religious belief that LGBT folks don't deserve care, then they could withhold that in North Carolina without any kind of ramification. Additionally, there's legislation that's being passed that if North Carolina, or being considered to be passed, we fully expect at this point that it will pass because of the defection that we had. There's legislation that will penalize medical providers for being willing to provide life-saving care to trans folks. And that's really concerning. It's really concerning in a lot of ways. And these are all laws that are passing in large part because of the atmosphere that Dobbs created. Not directly necessarily related to the legal reasoning in Dobbs, but we're expecting that at the federal court level, we're going to begin to see a lot more challenges related to the sexual freedoms that LGBT families have only really only recently been afforded. Lawrence versus Texas, other cases that permit and decriminalize homosexual sex or acts of sodomy, depending on how the statutes define it. And, you know, sexual regulation that has only been selectively targeted at our community. You know, not that cishet people don't engage in the exact same acts, but LGBT folks are targeted for those acts. And so we've got a lot of concerns still in the LGBT community related to Dobbs, and we're fighting fires everywhere in every state. And I think from the perspective of reproductive justice, you know, the issue of whether or not assisted reproduction is available to LGBT families is just the tip of the iceberg. It has been traditionally used by LGBT families in order to create family, in large part because same-sex couples, you know, one of them doesn't have sperm, one of them doesn't have, you know, eggs. And so necessarily there has to be a volunteer somewhere, and same-sex couples will use donor eggs and donor sperm. Sometimes they'll get donated embryos. So we've got people who aren't genetically related to, no parent who's genetically related to the child whom they're going to raise. We've got the use of gestational carriers for gay men. And, you know, as Dobbs becomes, you know, more impactful on the medical community, what the American Society for Reproductive Medicine has been concerned about is this issue of fetal personhood. This idea that an embryo or a zygote could be considered a person, and therefore assisted reproduction could become prohibited based on that view. A lot of what doctors have to do in order to create embryos, you know, could come under scrutiny. There were at the beginning of, well, immediately after Dobbs, as they were passing abortion legislation across the states, there were some states that were carving out assisted reproduction and making it exempt from some of the more restrictive abortion related regulations. But then states began to remove those carve outs because they didn't want to exempt, you know, fetal reduction, for instance, from being considered abortion. They wanted to be able to control what happened to excess embryos. They wanted to be able to say that those embryos could not be destroyed, could not be donated for scientific purposes. And from an LGBT perspective, what we're seeing across the country is beginning of attacks on LGBT parenthood. And so what we expect to happen is that as those attacks gather momentum, as it becomes, you know, part of a strategy to say LGBT folks shouldn't be guaranteed the right to parent, because this right to parent also is a right that derives from Roe, right? It's one of the many cases that came after Roe that established that people have a right, constitutional right to parent. And so if Roe can be reversed, this right can also be reversed. And one of the things that we're worried will happen is that assisted reproduction will be limited and denied to LGBT people because they shouldn't have the right to parent, or they won't have the right to parent if certain kinds of cases are brought and are successful. And so we're really looking at some fairly dark times from my perspective for the LGBT community. And that's, you know, before Dobbs, we were already facing lots of challenges related to establishing families. In the United States, broadly, typically, parents are defined to be natural and or biological and or genetic. And sometimes statutes will carve out in more progressive states parents by intention, but by and large, most states say that a parent is somebody who's biological or genetic and or adoptive. And the problem that we've been having is selective enforcement of these standards in custody cases and in parentage cases across the country. Cishet folks, they also get embryo donation. They also get egg donation. They also get sperm donation. They are often not the genetic or natural parents of the children that they are raising, but people don't know it because they've got cishet privilege, right? This presumption that you are the parent of the children that you're raising, whether or not that happens to be true. And LGBT folks suffer from the opposite, and that is this assumption that we're not the genetic parents of the children we're raising. Eventually, CRISPR technology is going to make it possible for LGBT folks to be genetically related, to children, their children, both LGBT folks. But that's not where we are right now. And so LGBT parents, in addition to having to deal with the cost of assisted reproduction, they're dealing with the legal cost of establishing parentage. First they get just a gay male couple, for instance, right? They get an egg donor, have an egg donor agreement. Then they've got a gestational carrier, and they have a gestational carrier agreement. And then in order for them both to be parents, they have to have a parentage order. And so then we've got $100,000 for gestational carrier. We've got $15,000, to $30,000 for IVF. We've got another $15,000 in legal fees. And that's what it takes to be a parent of a child to whom one of you is genetically related, if you're a gay male couple. Yeah. And that makes it prohibitively expensive. People who are of limited economic resources can't have a child that way. And so more and more what I'm seeing in my practice are people who of limited economic means who have opted to have a child by intercourse with a friend or someone who they thought was volunteering to be a gestational carrier, and no agreements because they couldn't afford it, no legal counsel because they couldn't afford it, and suddenly they're in a full-blown custody battle with somebody who they never thought they were going to be a parent with, sharing a child forever. And it's becoming more and more common. We see these cases more and more every day. And that's one demographic of the LGBT community. And the other demographic we deal with are the ones, who are the ones of us who are privileged enough financially to be able to have all of the protections in place so that we can be intended parents in the way that we intend to be parents, right? With the people who we intend to be parents with. And so Dobbs is concerning, but it's not the end all be all for us. It's just the beginning of what looks like it's going to be a cascade of really difficult and complicated impacts on the LGBT community of all the litigation we expect to ensue even after Dobbs.
I have to say, I might have said this earlier. I lost track of what I said, but I think it's just so there's this bitter irony in this personhood being conferred on a blastocyst, right? When it's not conferred on Black people, brown people, LGBTQ people, poor people, like that having equal rights under the law is not functionally a thing in this country, but suddenly unborn fetuses, embryos, etc., are being considered more important, obviously more important than the people carrying them, and then other people who don't get those rights. I have a question. I have a friend. I thought that this used to describe gestational surrogacy. I think that in many places that's the only surrogacy that's allowed, but I'm not absolutely sure. But I have a friend who did traditional surrogacy as a cost saver, contracted with someone, and it's not a horror story. Like, it actually, it looks like so the money. This is where the money issue is in surrogacy. The question of exploitation is somewhere between nothing and not getting paid for the burden of carrying a child, and getting paid something that really changes the life circumstance of a person. Changing the life circumstance of a person is seen, I think if I understand this correctly, is seen as potentially exploitative, coercive, because they don't really have the full choice to not do that. So this person put an addition on their house. It didn't totally change their life circumstance. It might have felt that briefly, but it was like a little extra money. She had done this before for others, and the child has full access to the biological siblings, both being raised by the surrogate and by other people. It's sort of at that level, though all the stuff around getting pregnant and keeping a pregnancy is quite different, and relinquishing a child is quite different from adoption. It felt like the relationships that are built in open adoption. But I was like, oh, traditional surrogacy can be okay. So just from your perspective, legally, ethically, et cetera, where are the laws around traditional and gestational? I'm curious, where are the laws around gestational and traditional surrogacy?
Yeah, from a legal perspective, the best practice is to have a gestational carrier. In many states, what you're calling a traditional surrogate is also known as a parent. Yes, so that would be in North Carolina. A traditional surrogate is known as a parent, and it is a different process to terminate a parent's rights than it is to get an order for somebody who's a gestational carrier. And so people will do it. People do traditional surrogacy. Typically, attorneys who are working in assisted reproduction do not want to help those people because it is ethically complicated. Many laws, many states' laws prohibit the payment for the relinquishment of a child. It's prohibited. And so the fees that might be exchanged in what's called a traditional surrogacy arrangement could be criminal in nature. Yeah. And I think it's also kind of morally complicated, right? If people don't have free choice, like meaning they don't have, it's financially necessary for them for whatever reason to carry a child and to be paid something, that I might consider to be minimally acceptable, if at all, in order for someone else to use our body as a vessel. Like when I think about that personally, and I was joking, I haven't had any children of my own, and in part, it's one of the gifts of being lesbian. I don't have to use my own uterus. But, I could not imagine how much someone would have to pay me in order to voluntarily bear a child. So, there's the question of how much choice does someone have if they are not financially comfortable and they're choosing to be a carrier.
Someone asked, and I just want to clarify what is meant by traditional surrogacy, and it's when the egg of the surrogate is the egg that is used, however that the pregnancy occurs. So in most states, absolutely, in any state. Actually, I'm not sure that this isn't totally true for some states around gestational surrogacy, that the person who births the child is legally the mother, except in cases where there's, I mean, I don't actually understand the thing, but I've got another question for you. I've got two more questions stacked. One is, there was a mention of embryo donation
Yes.
in one of the slides, and embryo adoption as like another term for it. And I know you and I talked about that at some point, which is so you're going to explain why embryo donation is the preferred term, and I'm going to explain why like oddly I can understand that though it's not preferable for very good reasons, the idea that this embryo created by two people who were trying to have a child, that story, that narrative for a child might be different than a single gamete donation. And also the idea that it's mostly people who, like many people who have turned to relinquish or place when they don't do abortion. Embryo donation is also not because of legally imposition, but because they choose not to. Embryo donation is mostly people who don't want to, as many Jews feel free to, many others feel free to dispose of the extra embryos or donate the extra embryos for research.
Mhm.
So embryo donation versus embryo adoption, and anything else that
Embryo donation is the preferred term because in many states, embryo adoption laws are being put into place, and they are a stepping stone to fetal personhood. If you say adoption, which is a process wherein one set of parents or a parent relinquishes a child for the purposes of being raised by someone else, the terminology of adoption implies personhood. And so what's happening in some states is that they're passing embryo adoption laws as a stepping stone to creating fetal personhood. And so from a perspective of, being pro-choice for adoption, for abortion, our perspective is that you shouldn't use the term embryo adoption, that it should be embryo donation. They're gametes that have been combined and have, have multiplied a little bit, but it's just not capable of life. It's in many states, personal property still, and that's how we would like it to remain, ideally. Yeah.
Then someone asked, aren't the anti-trans medical care bills, I guess the anti-gender affirming care bills, and I'm not sure I understand this, so I'm going to ask Carol to bop in if you don't understand this, exactly the same premise as the denial of medical care for abortion. Is that, Carol, do you want to clarify what?
Yeah, actually Miriam was on too, because we were having this conversation. I mean, it's denial of medical care. Abortion is denial of medical care, and anti-trans bills are denial of medical care. It's exactly, from my perspective, the same premise. I mean, they're picking anti-trans right now because gay marriage is an accepted thing. So they're looking, meaning the far right or the religious right, are looking for something, right, to use. So the bills are not anti-lesbian and gay necessarily, although the Roe ones are, but the anti-trans medical bills, at least that's what I think, are specifically picked because people, trans is different. They don't understand it. They don't know them. Everybody knows somebody who's a lesbian or a gay person.
Everybody probably also knows somebody who's a trans person. They just
They
don't.
may, but may not. Yeah.
Right.
The thing is, we want to, abortion obviously is healthcare and it should be treated that way, but that is not my understanding of how it's being argued legislatively. It's not being argued as a form of healthcare that's being restricted. It's being argued from this personhood status. So it does still seem to me to be a different approach to the same goal of oppression.
Right, but I'm saying what we think of it. We think this is all medical care. They are denying medical care, just like women are being denied medical care. So, I mean, okay, maybe it's far out, but that's what it feels like to me. The anti-trans bills are awful. They are just awful.
Yeah. I mean, I think women are being denied medical care, abortion-related medical care for very different purposes than trans people are being denied care. Ultimately, it is a matter of objectifying. I've got a dog who's whining back here. I apologize. That's what you're hearing. I think it's his cookie time. He's really a great timer. So he's just kind of letting me know that it must be, is it near 9 o'clock? Yes. Okay. Yeah, that's cookie time. Women are being denied abortion related care because their value as vessels is more important than their value as individuals. And trans people are being denied medical care because fundamentally the religious right and the right in our country don't believe that trans people should exist.
So Debbie, I just want to say Debbie Trope, our Jewish Studies co-chair, says, and I've just lost my place because there's a new thing, being denied the autonomy of making their own medically necessary decisions in both cases, just as that's a parallel. And Sarah, who can speak up, she wrote it to everyone, so everyone can read her chat comment. I wanted to throw in also I think it was mentioned before, but when all these extra embryos are created, because they're going to be ones that are flawed, they're going to be ones that that may not rise to the top of the crop. And there are going to be ones that are frozen but then not used because yay, there was a successful implantation brought to term, which there's a lot of steps. You can have implementation and then a lot of miscarriages. But there are all of these frozen embryos, and they are mostly donated to science or discarded or saved for a while the family figures out if they're doing it again and want to use younger versions of themselves or their gametes. But the pressure now with personhood is what do fertility clinics, how do they protect the eggs for these folks? And I think someone mentioned before that there are so many, the woman who founded the Jewish Fertility Foundation said to me that there are fertility clinics in the north that are sort of moving their stores of embryos to other places where it's safe. But the fragility of these embryos is insane, and the technology to keep them frozen is insane. And so the cost of that transfer, in addition to the enormous cost of just doing this process, which I think probably doesn't add up to the $120,000 or something of surrogacy, but is $20,000 a cycle or something. I don't know. Maybe there's that I don't know what it is now. Somewhere between 5 and 15 a cycle. Is that?
Oh, it really depends on how much you're doing in terms of medication and facility fees and whatever, but it's not unusual to spend $30,000 on a cycle.
Wow.
And that's with your insurance covering some parts of it.
Yeah, so right. So then it adds enormously to that, which then in terms of the larger ethical questions, not that these technologies shouldn't be made available to people, but then what do we do about the fact that writ large, this is all giving the privilege to parent to those who have money and not to those who don't. And that's just a fundamental, these money questions are fundamental ethical questions.
There's also a sex imbalance there for embryo storage, where if let's assume a cishet couple where if the male partner doesn't want to go forward with a transfer, or if the couple divorces or separates for whatever reason, usually the agreement states that both have co-ownership of the embryos, and if the marriage dissolves, then the embryos are destroyed. It's difficult to say what happens to that in a state that outlaws destruction of embryos, but there's also the sex imbalance there, which is that in many cases, it's not a big deal for someone who's producing sperm or semen to do that at whatever age of their life. But if you have a partnership where there's a person who's getting eggs retrieved and made into embryos, that kind of stuff, like the sooner you do it, the better your chances are. And if you have embryos and there's someone that has power to destroy those embryos, that can create all sorts of situations for domestic abuse, for people staying in relationships they don't want to be in just to continue their access to reproductive technology. And the implications of that are huge.
We've got one more question that we may or may not be able to answer. Is there some Jewish position on the denial of medical care that Carol raised? Is there an imperative to provide care, even if there might be some objection from a Jewish ethical perspective or a halakhic perspective?
Do we mean, should Jewish medical professionals be obligated to provide care regardless of the patient's LGBTQ status or other issues like that? Is that what we're asking specifically about biomedical ethics that impact Jewish doctors? That I can't really speak to.
We can bring back Island for that one.
No, so that's the, I mean, except to say that we live in a free country where no Jewish person is obliged to observe Jewish law. That's what freedom from establishing a religion means. You can't compel Jewish people to follow Jewish law. So I don't think we want to create a situation where Jewish doctors are forced to perform abortions because Judaism says you should.
I don't think she's asking that.
Okay,
I'm just
maybe I
saying if there is
misunderstood
Jewish ethical view. I mean, I'm sure there are actually, two Jews, three opinions. There are probably many Jewish ethical views on what one does in instances like this. But I mean, they're the basic fundamental, treat the patient, help not harm is general and Jewish, but I can't speak more specifically than that. I'm just looking, let's see.
We've got somebody who has their hand up. Maybe they have an answer. Miriam Eisen.
Miriam, do you want to unmute? Miriam, do you have an answer?
No, I was thinking of an example, though, where refusal to treat an ectopic pregnancy would violate pikuach nefesh. I mean, there are some situations where the doctor is put to a choice of obeying the law or obeying Jewish and other ethics.
Right.
That that's sort of a narrow band there.
That's
I'm
an
looking-
impossible situation because people
Yeah.
who have ectopic pregnancies are typically young and can go from totally normal vital signs to ruptured organs and hemorrhaging and dying. So people who have ectopic pregnancies, it's impossible to say, like, when is the pikuach nefesh? When can you compel a doctor to treat a pregnancy? Do you have to wait until the organs have ruptured and do an emergency surgery? Or can you schedule at a more relaxed pace an emergency surgery to remove a pregnancy? Can you compel a doctor to prescribe medical abortion in cases of ectopic pregnancies? These are
Right.
treated differently in every state at the moment. It's not at all clear what it means to save a life in these kinds of cases.
Right. Thought of broadly, given the stats on suicide for trans individuals, even if it's not a life-threatening situation, the pikuach nefesh could be considered to apply. It is 9:01, so I want to give permission. I want to thank everyone and give permission to people who want to drop off and say it's been a great evening. And next week is going to be awesome too. So please come back for with some really amazing experts then too. Thank you, Milan and Sarah. You've been awesome. Please stay on if you can. we're gonna, I think, okay, so I'm gonna go with the hands raised thing. Debbie, you're off mute.
Thank you.
Okay, so quickly,
And
I
then
was just gonna provide a less from, well, I would say less dramatic, but anecdotal example of my family, right? So a few years past Roe, my mother had a DNC. She already had 4 children. She was the 5th. I don't believe my mom had any miscarriages, but she was early 40s and recently been diagnosed with fairly aggressive breast cancer. Now, at the time, this is Indiana, by the way, so now a DNC would be considered very problematic. You don't have to come up with even the most extreme examples to envision situations where the current rollout of legislation creates real problems in undermining the health and welfare of a mother or potential mother. And, it's amazing to me that we've gotten to the point where this is even a question, that like the ability to take that step. Yes, mental health is also health, absolutely, but it's a combination of, the fact that we're actually at a point where this would be a problematic decision to make in so many locations is just such a painful one to me. Because of course my mother should be able to make a decision that would allow her to survive. She survived for 40 more years, right? Almost 40 years. So, just bringing that up is, that these things are really maybe more common than we might otherwise think.
Thank you. Rana, you want I have to ask you to unmute, or you're good?
There we go. Can you all hear me?
Yeah, and anybody who wants to ask a question, use the reaction thing to put your hand up rather than actually putting your hand up, because I cannot see everybody. Okay.
So 2 things. One, I mean, what Deborah just said is so relevant because, I mean, many cancers are fueled by estrogen and progesterone, which are both high during a pregnancy, right? So when pregnant folks develop breast cancers in particular, tend disproportionately have estrogen and progesterone receptors, but there are a number of other cancers that grow because of those receptors. So and it does happen more often than you think, and there are just a number of other health conditions during pregnancy. I mean, I just want to remind folks that pregnancy is much more dangerous than abortion, right? Significantly so. Around the ectopic pregnancy, I just wanted to note here that I mean, there are some folks who are starting to shift language in both in the medical field and in the scientific field, and calling them ectopic implantations, in part because these are never viable pregnancies. They are never actually. So that is not to say that the person who was carrying that embryo that implanted in an unusual spot outside of the inside of the uterus, right, which is what ectopic means. It means in the not usual place, right? Often they have been trying to get pregnant and are excited, and they have a positive pregnancy test. So that is not to negate the emotional experience of that loss in any way, but it is to try to clarify that there is no question about, there are not 2 lives at stake there. There is 1 life at stake there. Like that is it. That is always the case. And the procedure is different. So unlike medical management of miscarriage, which in many hospitals also is being delayed and can lead very quickly to sepsis and other very serious conditions, right? Where you can go from okay to really not okay quite quickly. But the procedures for medical management of an incomplete miscarriage are the same as the procedures that are used for abortion. This is not the case for ectopic pregnancy because by definition, an ectopic pregnancy is not inside the uterus, and that is what abortion procedures do. So just like,
Mhm.
the scientist in me is always wanting to kind of like when we're talking about the ethics here, I think with ectopic pregnancy in particular, there's only one life at stake, but also just reminding us how different these are. So
Right, and it's all relevant to the top, I think. I'm not sure about ectopic pregnancy because I don't know the tech. I mean, I don't know what happens, but in terms of high risk pregnancies that are dangerous, there's a legal case, and it's in the handout both weeks, actually, a legal case in Kentucky, I think, where they're using their religious freedom argument to argue not about abortion, but about the implications for IVF. And the implications were I'm trying to have babies, and you're putting my life at risk. It's really relevant. Okay, Annie Rosenthal.
Sorry, just to.
Oh,
just
sorry,
to-
go ahead.
Yeah,
Sorry.
so I'm really against the idea of carve outs for anything, whether it's carve outs for, like non-viable pregnancies or carve outs for life-threatening pregnancies or carve outs for this thing or that thing. I think those are dangerous because when you start saying, oh, but it's okay, it won't affect this group or that group, what we need to be fighting for is comprehensive protection for everyone to be able to make the choices they want to make. And so I worry that when we protect the interests of some groups and not other groups, because anyone who doesn't want to be carrying a pregnancy should be able to terminate that pregnancy for whatever reason at whatever time, in my personal opinion. And in Judaism, one concept of a pregnancy is that it's a rodef or a pursuer. Any pregnancy is a pursuer. And it's a danger to your health and to your life. And that's one of the concepts that we use in Judaism to say, yeah, look, in some cases, Jewish law says you should abort a pregnancy. And in other cases, there are various interpretations of, permissibility. Partly because of this concept that a pregnancy is always a danger to the pregnant person's health. Even when it's very healthy and very wanted, it's still dangerous.
Thank you. Annie.
Can I say amen to that? I completely agree. And I'm somebody who has been through some of the situations that you're talking about with a non-pregnancy with a baby who was diagnosed with a non-viable condition at 24 weeks. And I was able to terminate that pregnancy, but because my husband and I were both federal employees, we could not get insurance to pay for it. And it was a pretty expensive hospital stay. But I was mostly going to follow up on what Deborah said, thinking about even in the pre-Roe days. And I have two family situations that fall right into that. One is an aunt who had a heart condition. She did manage to deliver one baby successfully when she got pregnant again. And this would have been in the early 1940s, I think. It was before I was born. She was my father's oldest sister. And her doctor actually told her she should terminate the pregnancy because it was too great a threat to her life. And he was willing to do it then. And she really wanted to try to carry the pregnancy to term. And in the end, she and the fetus both died. And on the other side of my family, my mother-in-law's sister had a baby who died in utero at about 7 months and lived in a much more conservative area and was not able to have a procedure to expel that pregnancy and did end up getting very ill because she was carrying around dead tissue in her body. So, and she did survive it. It wasn't, it was life-threatening, but I don't know what a doctor would have said in the case of some of these laws.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, if there aren't any other questions, think we may, if there was a question, was there a question embedded in that, Annie? No, okay. Just double checking.
Oh, okay, sorry. I had to unmute.
Thank you. I just want to really send massive appreciation to our guest speakers, Sarah and Milan. It was really wonderful to have you with us, and people have been sending chats to me saying how exceptional the speakers were and how appreciative they are. So thank you so much. And everybody want to come off mute and just say thank you, good night, and we'll call it a day.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Bye.